Hi, everybody. My name is Jackie Labbe. I'm Vice-Chancellor Academic at Montfort University. I also do some teaching on the English Lit BA degree. And I've come along just to talk to you a little bit about some of the things that, as you all know, we've been undergoing over the last few months, and to give you some insights, I hope, into the preparations that we're making for the coming academic year. So I've got some things that I want to share with you, but there will be plenty of time also to go over the questions that you've submitted as well. I'm going to do my best to answer all of the questions as fully as I possibly can. Just to say up front, there won't be answers for every question, and that's purely because there aren't answers for some of the things that we want all of us to know about. In many ways, we're still at the mercy of what the government decides, what COVID-19 decides in a way. But I want to try to give you as much information as I possibly can. And I thought I'd just start by going over again what things were like a couple of months ago when lockdown started and we went into our kind of emergency response period. So I'm sure you'll all remember this. It was on the 16th of March, so more than 3 months ago, that we decided that we needed to go online for the rest of this academic year, and that we would start that from the 23rd of March. So in order to try to give staff and students a little bit of time to prepare for this, that was the week that we suspended teaching for 3 days, for the 18th, 19th, and 20th of March. And staff worked very hard then to try to arrange for remaining material for the last couple of weeks of term to go online. You'll remember at that time we were still trying very hard to keep the campus open as much as possible, but it seemed like every day, as soon as we made a decision about something that could remain open, that very evening there would be a change in policy or in requirements or rules, which meant we had to change our minds very quickly. In response to the things that we had to do, we basically had to close the campus in a way that we didn't want to do, and certainly in a much more rapid way than we ever would have wanted to do. There was really no choice around this, and I know a lot of people were feeling incredibly anxious anyway about the fact that the campus was still open and there was still quite a lot of movement around it. But it was very definitely less than ideal for everybody, really. We also decided that the only way really to make sure that our exams could function properly was to move those online. This was purely because we realized there was going to be no way where we could move hundreds of people into an exam hall, for instance, to take an exam at that period of time. But nonetheless, exams for many students were still necessary. But we also tried to do a little bit of work to have a look at some of the exams that were scheduled to see if they really needed to be an exam, or could they be some other form of test or assessment. This was to try to make the exams that needed to run as smoothly as possible, as we wanted to move those to a 24-hour window approach, because we were aware that some students were in the UK, some students were no longer in the UK, and many students also were going back to situations, home lives, that could be uncertain, that could be noisy, that could be crowded, and they themselves might be ill or know people who were ill. So we felt that by trying to give a 24-hour approach to the exams, it gave a little bit more time, a little bit less pressure in being having to take those exams. We also instituted the 2-week extension to your assessments as a response to this change, and I know that won't have compensated entirely, but it was an attempt to do so. And we introduced our no detriment approach to help support our students whose lives had changed so dramatically. Now, this has been incredibly complicated, and I know you've had lots of questions around no detriment, as have staff. It's proved more complicated for us partly because of our academic calendar, the fact that we're on undergraduate level, year-long terms, so your modules more or less go for the whole year. Not every module had enough assessment, for instance, by the time that we introduced no detriment to allow it to operate at module level. And that meant we had to think about year level in previous years. It was very complicated to try to figure out how that would work in a logical approach. And here I'm talking about the kind of programming logic that was needed to make it work. And that's why it did take us some time to be able to give you proper answers to the questions that you were rightly asking. But I hope now it's a little more clear. And I also hope that you do understand that as long as you do meet the requirements, which is that you finish your assessments and you passed your assessments and your module, that no detriment will be applied. And what will happen is that at your exam boards, the exam board will look at what your marks would look like if no detriment wasn't applied and what your marks will look like if it was applied, and they'll choose the best outcome. So that will happen basically automatically at examination boards, and then when your results come out, you will get the mark that is better of those two. When we all came back from vacation, and I know some students studied over much of vacation as well, the rest of semester 2 for our PGT students, our master's students, and indeed the summer studying that is going on now, so in semester 3, for instance, we still feel the impact of the lockdown. We haven't been able to open buildings. We haven't been able to use our campus. We know that that has made things very difficult. It's made things difficult across the board. There isn't really any choice. We can't open buildings if we're not permitted to, and we haven't been able to revamp the campus in a way that will be required within physical distancing. So I entirely understand how difficult this is, and particularly for students who are studying practical and applied subjects, not to be able to get into labs and studios. If there was any way to get you in, we would have gotten you in. We are as constricted, I suppose, by the situation that we're all in as any sector is. But we are working on ways to try to make sure that you can still access learning materials, learning support, new kinds of learning support. So I'm sure most of you know that we were able to bring on the Creative Cloud from Adobe for many students, that both class and MLC in the library have been open all along for online support, that SAS student support services, academic support services have also been open all along for student support. People are working as much as they can in their own often very hurried home environments to make sure that we can give you the support that I know that you want and I know that you need. So while it's not been what we would normally have, we've been trying as much as possible to be able to give you a version of it. And I do hope that, for at least most of you, that has been working for you. Now, we've had to be very reactionary over the last couple of months. Things have changed so quickly that, as I said earlier, it felt almost as soon as we had made a kind of decision, we were told to make a new decision. We had to work so quickly that meant that we couldn't always talk to people as quickly as we wanted to, that we couldn't always do the consultation that we would normally want to be able to do. We had to finish out a year in very straitened circumstances. As we're going into the summer, we're still somewhat in that kind of situation. All along, we have had a group that called our Next Steps group, made up of academics from across the faculties, from student support services, and also from DSU, working on what we could do over these last few months and into the summer to try to make it as effective as possible for you. And I want to reassure you that all along, the DSU has been part of these conversations, and Laura Flowers has been absolutely exemplary in making sure that your interests are represented and in reaching out to you and then feeding back your points of view and perspective into the decision making that we have had to do. I know some of you may have been able to benefit from some other forms of student support that we've been able to offer, for instance, the provision of laptops to those students who really needed them. dongles to those students for whose Wi-Fi was no good or not sufficient. And we have had students remaining in our accommodation throughout this period who weren't able to return to a different home. And some of those students have needed support with food and medicine. Many of those students have now left, but some are still with us, and we are ensuring that they are looked after as much as they possibly can be. So that was the situation that we have been in, and that's the situation that we are to a certain extent still in. But we're also now thinking about next year. And while we've had to be, as I said, very reactionary for the last few months, we want to try to plan things for the coming year, because our aim is really to make sure that we can give you the best learning experiences that we possibly can within the constraints that COVID-19 put on all of us. And that is the aim all along. And alongside that, to make sure that the health and well-being of everybody in our university community is absolutely prioritized. So the decisions that we make are really in those two prongs. Your learning is of the utmost importance. So too is your health and well-being. Sometimes when we put those two things together, what comes out on the other side is maybe a little different. Well, will be a little different to what we would like to give you, but it's attempting to marry up these two very important priorities. So we have established certain principles. So for instance, we did decide to move all of our lectures online. Now I want to make sure that you understand that lectures is a particular form of your learning. This is the kind of thing where you're in a large lecture hall with sometimes up to a couple of hundred other students. You don't normally do very much interaction. You listen to the lecturer who presents you with information, shares knowledge with you. That's the kind of thing that's going online. And that doesn't mean that that's the only kind of learning that is available to you. But we've had to put this kind of learning online because, as with the exam period, we simply won't be in a position to have hundreds of students moving in and out of relatively small rooms within the restraints of physical distancing. So we decided early on to put those online. We also decided to make those what's known as asynchronous. And asynchronous simply means that it's not live, it's pre-recorded. The biggest reason for doing this was then to free up time in our rather complicated timetable so that we could develop enough live teaching, which on the online world is called synchronous teaching. So live teaching and then as much face-to-face or in-person teaching as we possibly could in the teaching period that we have, which is Monday through Friday teaching period. So by moving our lectures into this pre-recorded mode, it meant that much more of the timetable was available for other forms of teaching that will either be face-to-face or will be live. We want to arrange as much face-to-face teaching as we possibly can. Now, we're trying to prioritize the kind of learning that needs to take place in a lab or in a workshop or in a studio, the kind of practical hands-on learning where you need to work with equipment or you need to work with materials of some kind. With physical distancing, what this means for room usage is that basically, if we have had a room that would have typically fit 100 students into it, the most we are now able to fit into that kind of room is about 25 students. So I think what you can see from that is that if we had any group that is larger than, say, 25 students, we are looking to use our very biggest rooms on campus, even for those smaller groups. And if you have a seminar group of maybe 15, 20, or 25 students, you need that kind of very big room, a room that you would have otherwise just fit 25 students into. That kind of room is going to fit about 5. And so it makes the timetabling much more complicated than it ever has been before. And that's why it's so hard at the moment to say exactly which part of your learning will be face-to-face live and which part of your learning will be live but online. Because we need to think about all of our buildings across the estate and how many students and staff we can fit into any one room at any one time and still observe physical distancing. Again, thinking about health and well-being and trying to put that together with your effective learning. Well, I've been leading a group which has the very interesting name of the Strategic Planning Group. This is also under the umbrella of thinking about your future here at DMU, your DMU future. And what we are trying to do within this group is exactly plan for the coming academic year, so that we can do things to a higher standard. I think the online teaching that we were able to give you in the emergency period was very good, but it was rushed. It has to be said. We had no forewarning. We had to do it very quickly. As we're thinking about the coming academic year, we want to use the time that is available over the summer to try to make what we give you to as high a standard as it possibly can be. So already we've produced guidance for staff, pedagogical tips and guidance around what does it mean to teach in a blended environment. Well, some of the learning will be online and live, some of the learning will be online and pre-recorded, some of the learning will be face-to-face, but in different sized groups, so the staff can really think about their subjects and how to convey them to you in a way that is effective and that works very well in the kind of situation that we will be in. Now, DMU will only be using Blackboard Collaborate and Microsoft Teams for its teaching. And we've decided on this because that means that we can provide the best amount of support and training possible. If we used a lot of different kinds of platforms, it would be a lot harder to support that and make sure that we had the really high quality training available. So we're only using those two modes. I want to reassure you that staff are being offered a whole raft of training so that they can make use of them in the best possible way. But we are also working on a training program for you, for the students, so that when you come back again in the autumn and you're picking up this new form of learning, we're trying to put in place a kind of safety net really for you so that you know how to learn in these different kind of environments. What does it mean to be in Collaborate? What does it mean to be in Teams, for instance? How can you interact with each other and with your tutors in the most effective kind of way? So we want to make that, get that in place for you so that you can pick that up in the second half of the summer and carrying forward. Now, Laura Flowers has also been working with many students to engage with the student voice, to hear what it was like for you in the emergency period and to try to learn from that on how we can make it better for you as we go into the next academic year. I've had a look at the results. I was really, really sorry to see how so many of you felt frustrated, concerned, unsupported. That's not good enough. And we're going to do everything we can to turn that around and make sure it doesn't happen like that in the forthcoming year. And definitely, if any of you feel not listened to, I always want to listen to you, and you can always come to me, but I know the Students' Union wants to listen to you, and I also know that your tutors really do want to listen to you. One thing maybe to keep in mind is that many academic staff as well as professional services staff were also in rather difficult positions as we went into the emergency period. You may not have gotten the answers that you needed then. They were living difficult lives as well, but that's not to say that that's an excuse. It's just a reason. And as we go into the academic year, we're about to start in a couple of months' time, we want to make sure you do get listened to and that you do get the responses that you need. So we're putting in place as much training, as many resources as we can, both electronic resources, enhanced digital resources. We want to try to make it so that the learning that we're offering you, you can take up in as effective way as possible. And we are also thinking very much about your safety and your well-being. This is very much at the forefront of our minds. As I said, the things that we are not able to do as yet that are predicated on people being in smallish spaces and a lot of people in those spaces, those are the kind of things that we have to wait to do until we can live that kind of life again. And we're not quite sure when that will happen, but it's probably not going to happen. That sort of mingling kind of lifestyle that we all miss so much is probably not going to happen, I think, before Christmas. A lot depends on what the science will devise, what the science will discover. We need better treatments. We need a vaccine, for instance, and we need to understand what it means to live with a virus like this. What I do want to say is that as we make these decisions, we want to let you know about them. I hope some of you have been able to see the letters that I've been sending out to students via email, and something like this to try to give you answers to as many questions as you have. So there's only a little bit more that I do want to say right now. There will be questions coming up that will sort of pull some more things and be able to address some of the queries that you have. I do know that accommodation is a big question that you have. Really, it's a very big decision for you. It's hard for any of us in the university to tell you, do it this way or do it that way. It will be a personal decision. What I do want to say is that we are planning for as much on-campus teaching as possible within the restraints, the constraints that we see. We do only own 2 of the halls of residence that many of you live in, which kind of limits some of the things that we can say about accommodation. But in R2, it's quite plain what you are entitled to. But I want you to think about as well the other things that the campus offers you. The library is still on campus. The campus center is still on campus. Sports facilities will be opening as soon as they can. They're accessible through campus. Social activities will be different. Some will not be face-to-face, some might be, but they will develop as soon as they possibly can. Study spaces on campus will be there for you, albeit reconfigured, but still there. And access to things like Wi-Fi, computers, other equipment are part of the learning experience as well. So while I'm not pretending that that's going to answer your every question about accommodation, it's really just thinking that there are a lot of things that go into the decision making about where you might live. So it's not going to be the same, but we're working very hard to try to make it as good, just different. It can't be the same right now, but our plans are really aiming to make your study, your overall study experience as good as it possibly can be, while also keeping you and staff safe and confident that it is safe to be at DMU. You will have questions. I'm not going to say anything more in terms of my kind of delivery, my sort of lecture for you, but I'm happy now to start addressing the questions that you have sent in ahead of time. So we can start seeing those now. So do you think DMU will keep their decision with online lectures for all of the next academic year when unis like Cambridge are going back and saying they may do smaller scale lectures? So I hope I've kind of answered that in describing what an online lecture really means. It's not the only form of teaching that you get. There's a lot of other forms of teaching. So yes, large scale lectures will be online, but other forms of teaching will, as far as we can make it, not be online, will be face-to-face, and still other forms of teaching may be online, but in a much more interactive kind of way. We will review this at any point that we possibly can. We have to be guided really by what we can do within physical distancing, and we have to be guided as well about what we can offer you in terms of making sure that your kind of experience of your learning. Next question. For practical courses, what will be the arrangements for access to workshops? So this is really the hard one, and this is the one that we're working on as much as we possibly can. We absolutely want to get students who are working on practical courses access to the practical spaces that they need in order to learn. Now, what we have learned is that it's also possible to sometimes recreate those spaces in other ways. So, for instance, I know some courses are working on being able to supply students with kind of it's hard to know the right phrase to put on it, but sort of materials in a box, and materials taking all sorts of different forms. So also for those students who, for whatever personal reason they might have, are not able to make it to campus, can also learn at least to a certain extent about the practicalities of their course, even if they're not able to get on campus. But it's absolutely a priority to get as many students as possible into these practical spaces, studios and workshops and labs. It may be at different times of day than you're used to, though having said that, it's not going to be anything like, sort of midnight or anything like that. But it will be in as effective a learning way as we possibly can. This is the kind of thing where we say, watch this space, because as soon as we have the arrangements clear, we will let you know. Next question. How will online lectures work for practical courses? So it's quite related, but one of the other things that we're going to be working on is having lecturers have access to the labs to pre-record some of the lectures that will be aimed at more practical courses, and to do demonstrations in a pre-recorded kind of way. and do as high a quality as we possibly can as well. So that kind of thing will be, it will be still an online lecture, but it'll be a demonstration rather than simply say something like what I'm doing right now, which is just talking at you. And that's going to be something that lecturers will be working on over the summer. Next question. How does timetabling work and what kinds of teaching will be timetabled in the coming year? Now, timetabling is complicated. Timetabling means that you have chosen the modules that you would like to take. And then what we've had to do this year, of course, is start to try to figure out, of the modules that you want to take, what are the ones that we can get on campus so that you can take them in a kind of in-person kind of way? What are the kind of modules that might have to be online? What proportion of the online modules might we be able to have some form of face-to-face or in-person teaching as well? And then how does that work in all of the permutations and combinations of choice that students have across the whole university within a limited amount of rooms, and those rooms being used within a limited amount of time across the day, because we can't obviously teach on a 24/7 kind of clock. And here I'm talking about the actual teaching. So all of that information needs to go into the timetabling machine. And then what comes out on the other end will give us a sense of clarity about the kinds of teaching that will be of those different sorts. So online and live or face-to-face. Really, the kinds of teaching that will be timetabled will be anything that requires a specific time of day, so that you know that it'll be, say, Monday at 10, Wednesday at 2, something like that. Your lectures won't be timetabled, but they will be available for you at a particular time in the previous week, so that you know exactly when the lecture content will be released. And that will be, we will be able to tell you when exactly that will be very shortly. So that, for instance, if you have some kind of a live meeting, say on Tuesday at 2, and it means that you would have normally had a lecture maybe on the Monday, you can be sure that that lecture material will be available for you that previous week at that particular time, so that you can go into the live teaching with the material that you need from the lecture kind of asynchronous or pre-recorded lecture format. So anything that requires a particular time of day will be timetabled. And some of that will be online and some of that will be face-to-face. Your timetables will be released on the 28th of September for continuing students, and then new students will get them a few days later. So at that point, you will get a sense of what your actual timetable will look like. Now, I didn't say earlier when I was talking about the principles for the coming year, but we are also aiming that anything that is live, so anything that is on the timetable, will have a virtual version as well, either through using replay or some other format, so that if, for instance, that's a time that you can't make either in an online way or a face-to-face way, there will be a virtual version as well. So we're trying to ensure that if students have various restraints that they have no choice around, that they're shielding, somebody they know is shielding, carrying responsibilities, anything that is COVID related that makes getting to campus difficult. And that includes things like the difficulties that we're currently experiencing around public transport and that kind of thing, that you will still be able to pick up that learning in an online version as well. How about the next? I'm an EU student currently in my country. Should I return in October or stay in my country and follow online lectures? If you can return, then I think you should return. I recognize that there will be difficulties around that. Some countries will not necessarily want their citizens to leave and return to this country. At present, the UK has a quarantine approach to arrivals. We don't know if that will still be in place in the autumn, but it might be, which obviously makes return from another country difficult. As I said, there will be online alternatives to any kind of face-to-face teaching that we are developing. At the end, it will be a personal choice. I think returning, if you can return, is to your benefit, because it does allow you then to pick up on the other things that are offered across the campus. And also, if we reach that hopeful point where things start to return more to normal, you are here as well. We have the next question. Any update on a reopening date for the Kimberlin Library? Well, yes. So libraries are able in general now to start moving towards being able to open. So you may not have known, but it's not just our university libraries, but libraries across the country have closed and have not been permitted to be open in line with other sort of public spaces. The library is currently preparing to open a click and collect service and hope to have that in place by July. And it is also working on what I think they're calling scan on demand, so that if you do need some item from the library, then they might be able to scan it for you and then send it to you electronically. So Dave Parks, who's the Director of Library and Learning Services, absolutely on top of this and is working as much as he can to make sure that access to the library, even if it's virtual at first, can be there as soon as possible. The click and collect model will be up and running as soon as it possibly can be. So, and then as soon as we can open it as an actual building, we will do so. So we're also working across the campus on a kind of phased opening of our buildings and thinking about which buildings need to open and in what kind of order. Everything needs to be deep cleaned. Everything needs to be absolutely ready for opening. Kimberlin will definitely be on that schedule. Next question. Will online classes mean less timetabled hours so we can get jobs and work? Well, as I said, anything that needs a time in which it would be delivered will be timetabled. Your lectures won't be timetabled per se, they'll be pre-recorded and available at a specific time. But again, since our aim is to make it so that timetabled, things that are offered at a particular time also do have an online version through replay or something else, that does mean that you would be able to pick it up in that kind of way. I think what it really means is that whereas in the past, all of your learning would have been basically on campus, unless you were doing distance learning, you would come to campus to come to your lectures, seminars, workshops, labs, and the rest of it. There will be much more of a mixture this coming year. And so your own personal timetable, I suppose, will look different. And maybe that will help with things like with jobs and paid work and other forms of work as well. How will seminars happen? So this will, again, be a mixture. So some will be online and live, and some will be face-to-face. Now, every faculty and in every program would have it in the past, but every program is working on trying to make sure that there is some in-person offering over the course of the term. This is what we're working on right now as it stands. And as soon as that has been determined, that's when we'll be able to tell you what that will look like. Seminars in an online fashion, they will happen differently. And I said earlier that staff are going to be able to pick up training in how to use Collaborate and Microsoft Teams as effectively as possible for learning. What this means is that we want to try to make sure that if you're in an online seminar, that it's interesting, that it's engaging, that it works for you, that it's more than just, a bunch of slides projected, but that there is give and take, there is interaction. So we're giving staff the capacity to learn how to do that really effectively. And some of our staff are absolutely fantastic at it, and others will need to learn a little bit more. But as I said, we also want to offer the training to you as well, so that you understand what it means to be in a room or in a breakout room or to use chat or something like that. So the aim will be to make them as interactive as they ever have been, but again, in a different kind of mode. Do students need to wear face masks on campus? Right now, this is a personal decision, since the government has mandated it for public transport, but not for being just sort of out and about. We have to see what happens with that, if that is going to be a move that will be made potentially in line with other forms of relaxation of some of the lockdown measures. It's not by any means a mandatory thing, unless in a way we're told to, or it looks like it would be good. But we want to make the campus feel safe. We want to make you feel confident in its safety. If wearing a face mask is something that helps with that, then that is something that people can choose to do, and that will be for staff as well. It's hard to say what things will look like in October. If we were to go outside right now, I'm sure you see as much as I do, a lot of variety in people wearing or not wearing face masks. When we come back as much as possible to the campus in October, we'll have to judge where we're at then and what that feels like in terms of things like face coverings. When is the latest we will find out that all teaching is online? Well, all teaching is not online. So this is kind of what I want to be able to give you some reassurance about, that much teaching will be online, but not all teaching will be online. And again, it will be kind of program by program, the proportion of online versus face-to-face, because of the need really to think about how we use our spaces, and thinking about how, if you have to get to a piece of equipment, for instance, in order to learn properly, that's the kind of face-to-face teaching that that requires presence. Other forms of learning doesn't require presence in that same kind of way. That's the balance that we're working on. Your timetables, as I said, will be released on the 28th of September, but we have been asked by the Office for Students, which is the regulatory body for the sector, to make sure that we have as much clarity as possible for our new students in the clearing period. We would aim to be ready for that, if not earlier, so that we can also let you know, our returning students. What's going to be considered as a large class when choosing what will be online? So this is the kind of thing where you're looking at probably, well, it's hard to say a number, but if I just pull a number off the top of my head, I would say 50 or 60 students or more, because we're thinking about the rooms that we have. If we're going to have 50 students in a room, that room would have to have the capacity to normally fit about 300, 250, something like that. We have very few rooms like that. So a large class is the kind of class where in the past you would have gone into, say, a lecture hall in Cleffin or in Queens or in Hugh Aston. We would have sat in the same room with anything but with 60 to a couple of hundred other students. And the lecturer would have simply delivered a lecture with very little interaction, where you mostly sat, hopefully took notes, listened in that kind of way. That's the kind of large class that will be automatically online. Next question. What's happening with DMU Global? That's such a good question. We're not at a place right now, are we, where we can hop on planes and go places. We're thinking very hard about how we can still offer some kind of global experience, even if at present it's not through mobility, it's not through travel. There's always been elements of DMU Global that didn't rely on trips. So for instance, learning a foreign language, or taking up some other form of kind of intercultural experience. So I don't have a proper answer for you yet on global, but it is something that is being worked on. We very much hope that in the spring of next year, we might be in a different kind of space where some kind of travel-based global will be possible again. What we do know is that we will not be able to do as much. We certainly won't be able to do, the really big kind of trips. And I know that for some of you who might have been thinking about, well, I'm going into my third year and here's my, here's where I get to do that. It's one of those, really, really unfortunate things that the world won't allow that now, the world that we're in. But global is being actively considered. We want to make sure that it is still there in some kind of fashion. And again, that's kind of information that as soon as a decision is made and information is ready, it will be ready for you. Your results. Yes, so exam boards are somewhat delayed this summer because when we instituted the 2-week extension, it meant that things were coming in later, which meant that marking happened later, which meant we had to think about the exam boards operating slightly later. But we're operating on this summer a kind of staggered release date thing. So whereas in the past all results may have been released on a single day in July, now it will depend on your faculty and program. So results are going to be released between the 6th and the 16th of July. What I would say is that if you don't know, you should check with your program leader about when your results will exactly be released. There's a variety of dates, faculty by faculty, within that 10-day period. And that's when your results will come out. And your certificates will then be ready shortly after that. I believe that the plan would be for those then to reach you by post. I don't know exactly about certificates, but as soon as your results are there, then those are your results, and certificates shortly follow. Is there a chance we'll go back to lectures sooner if the situation improves? If we can, we will. I think that it's pretty likely, as I said earlier, that at least while we're still in the calendar year 2020, the situation won't improve enough for that. But we're keeping our options open for the second term. We want to try to gauge that a little better as we get closer to that second term. And if we find that in 2021 that we can do that, we will do that, because ideally we would want to be all back together on campus. What's happening with sports and societies? So Students' Union is working very hard on this. They have the same constraints as the rest of us do around being able to do things physically. I think there's a lot of work being done on some online alternatives. I understand it's hard to do sports in an online way in many societies as well. But what we're looking at here is, again, as soon as things can happen in the way we'd like to, they will happen. Students' Union will be putting out information about that, and I think it's probably available right now. Sports facilities, so for instance, QE2 will be opening along with other buildings on campus, and access will be subject to physical distancing requirements. But as soon as, for instance, gyms can open, again, QE2 will open. So we have to somewhat follow what the government guidance and requirements are, and saying this kind of building or that kind of building, this kind of gathering or that kind of gathering. But we want to make these things available as soon as we possibly can. I think we have to consider for ourselves that we're in June. We're all back together for the new term in October. Between now and then, we can hope that things continue to improve, that they continue to be more and more accessible. It's very hard to know right now what things might look like in October, but we are going to plan as if it will be where we want it to be, but at the same time needing to remain within the requirements that we're under right now. Next question. So, postgrad student, and you have practical sessions to complete this year. Provisionally told that you may be able to return in August to complete these and sit exams. Is this likely to happen? So, all of our exams in August, and this includes resits for those students who might have to do that, will still be online. We won't be in August in a position to be able to get large numbers of students into rooms to take their exams. So they will still have to be online, and they'll follow more or less the same pattern that we saw in the exam period in May and early June. In terms of your practical sessions, this is again one of the really difficult things for us. We can't as yet open those practical spaces, but all tutors and programs have been working very hard to think about what are the alternatives. So alternative forms of assessments, different ways to approach your projects and your dissertations, so that you can still do the work that you need and want to do, even if the access is so restrained. So it's not a perfect answer. It's by far a perfect situation, by far from a perfect situation. But I think you can count on the fact that your exams, the August exams and the resit exams, will themselves still be in online format. How will course structure and outcomes for arts courses differ when they rely on making or performing? Yeah, again, one of these perfect questions and really hard to answer. What lecturers are definitely thinking about is exactly that situation, and working to provide or devise different forms of projects, different forms of assessments that students can undertake that, I guess, in a way, take you more into a virtual rather than a physical world and thinking about your work. I know there's been some fantastic work being done in performing arts. that made use of technology, made use of people being in different spaces, but sharing the online world. I saw the dance final project, for instance, and I thought it was fantastic. All of us, I think, are learning very quickly about what the technology will allow for and the different kind of ways in which we can do things. The thing that I really want to stress is that because your learning experience, your assessment experience is different because you can't get into these spaces, that means that the assessment of you, your marking, will also be utterly taking this into account. So there's not going to be a single situation where any student would be marked down because they couldn't get to the lab or they couldn't get to the workshop or the studio. All of that will be taken into account. And again, the no detriment policy is designed to also be taking that into account. So if you have coursework deferred until August, but still cannot access the labs which you need in order to do this coursework, what happens then? Okay, so again, this is quite a similar kind of question. If the access to the lab can't be managed, then lecturers are thinking about, well, what is the alternative kind of assessment that can be developed that would allow you still to show what you have learned, even if you can't actually get into the space in order to make something or devise something. So what I would say to every student is that you feel that you don't know how that will work, or if you feel that that is not clear to you, then go straight to your module leader and ask the question. If you do that and you don't get an answer, or you don't get an answer that satisfies you, then go to your program leader. And if that still doesn't work, then your associate professor for student experience in each faculty is there to help you with this kind of thing. And they can be reached through, for instance, your student advice centers and often through dedicated email inboxes. So just keep asking the questions. If you're not getting the answer that you need from your module leader, first of all, I'm very sorry that you're not getting that answer, but there will be the next stage that you can go to try to get that answer. How is DMU catering for new overseas students who may not be able to enter the UK in the October semester? So yeah, that is something, again, that we're working on right now. The quarantine situation, for instance, is very difficult for any student coming in from outside the UK. We need to think about what that means for those students who might enter and have to go straight into quarantine. We need to make sure that we can support those students in their learning and in making sure that they observe the government requirements around quarantine. We're also thinking again about those students who maybe aren't in that situation. They simply can't get back at all. So that's again why we want to make sure that any timed teachings, either the face-to-face or online, that is timetabled, also does have that virtual equivalent, so that students who can't actually be here, can't get into the campus or can't get into the country, can nonetheless pick up their teaching as much as possible in an online variant. Can third-year students with courses that would normally be predominantly practical defer for the years? We will basically be doing a totally different degree if things are mostly online. Students are always entitled to request a deferral, and I would say that if any of you are considering that, then you should start with your personal tutor or program leader, and also talk with your associate professor for student experience or your associate dean academic to see what the best choice would be for you. Sometimes it might feel like right now there's going to be no way to do it, but sometimes there will be a way to do it. And so I would really encourage you to talk to as many of your tutors that you possibly can, to work through the difficulties and to work through the complexities, to see if something like deferral is actually the right answer for you, or whether taking up what's going to be offered is actually the right answer. It's probably going to be very much individual on a student by student basis, rather than even a course by course basis, because every student, I think, will feel differently about what the alternative might be, and then we'll need to make their judgment about whether that will work for them. But always talk to somebody before you make the decision. And again, as I said before, if you're not getting a response from one person, go to the next person. And I stress that your associate professors for student experience and your faculties are always there for you. Can you predict how much, maybe a percentage, will be live for HLS students? Unfortunately, I can't. I wish I could. We are right now trying to work that out. When I say as much as possible, that's as much as I can say. We want to make it as much as possible. We very much want students to be able to learn in an effective environment. Now, live, I suppose it means, it depends on whether by live you mean live in the way we're doing it right now, which is live, or face-to-face as in person, so in the same space. Almost all of your teaching, other than lectures that fit that particular definition that I said, will be live. That is, they'll be timetabled. What we're working on still is how much of that will be physically present, how much of that will be online. What arrangements will be made for students who cannot get to campus physically due to shielding a family member or shielding themselves? Yeah, again, so this is thinking about that kind of teaching that might be face-to-face that has the virtual alternative. So again, using replay or some other format so that if you can't get in for that, that you can then pick up the learning in that kind of way. And for those students for whom it would normally be in a kind of workshop or practical space, this is another area that faculties are working on. Is there a way to enable you to be able to access the kind of materials that you might need to pick at least some of that learning up? We're absolutely aware that many students will be in these kinds of situations, and many other students will find it difficult to get to campus. Many students will not want, for instance, to use public transport or not want to use it in the way that they have before. And many students will feel quite anxious about what it means to be doing that kind of travel. We want to factor all of that into the decisions that we're making. Will attendance be recorded? Attendance will be recorded, but it'll be recorded in a different kind of way. Clearly, if we're not all of us in the same physical space, attendance operates in a different kind of way. Excuse me. Presence sometimes is what we'll be looking for. We do have to record attendance for our home students, because any student who is in receipt of a student loan company loan, we are obligated as a university to let the SLC know if students in receipt of the loan have not been attending. That's one of our legal obligations. And likewise, for our Tier 4 overseas students, we are obligated to let UKVI know if those students have not been attending according to a certain pattern that we devise. But at the same time, we do understand that these things will operate differently for our students in this coming year. So we are looking at how to make this work so that it doesn't become a burden on either staff or students. Would the no detriment policy also apply next year? I think it's safe to say no. The no detriment policy was a particular response to the particular situation that we saw ourselves in the last few months, where everything changed very rapidly, where students and staff were suddenly faced with very different situations they had no control over, and where changes just were being flung at us left, right, and center. As we go into the next academic year, it will be a different kind of year, but we will be able to plan that year in a way that was much harder to do over the last few months. So the no detriment policy is time limited. It really is just in effect for this academic year. Now, if something horrible happens in the next academic year, and I'm sure we all hope that it won't, then we would think about what our response might be to that. But our no detriment this year is in response to this academic year's difficulties. What will happen to design craft? It is perhaps 90% practical and online is not viable. How are we expected to work, receiving the same and support and facilities that we paid for? Most, if not all, of our practical and applied courses are going to be in a very similar situation, where there's a lot of practical and hands-on work in normal situations. So this is why we're working as hard as we can, thinking as hard as we can about getting students in those particular courses onto campus as much as we can. And this is, again, why it takes a while to work it through, because it will be design crafts, it will be architecture, it will be courses within HLS, it will be courses within Chem, anything that would normally require students to gather together into a room and work on things with their hands is going to look different in the coming academic year. Online is sometimes a little more viable than we think. There's a lot of different ways in which these things can be done that we're not used to doing, that will be brand new. they might not be unviable. And that's another thing that we're working on it as much as we possibly can. The aim, as I said at the very beginning, we want your learning to be effective. We want you to learn in the way that you need to learn. At the same time, we need to maintain well-being and health and safety. It's when you start to put those things together that sometimes we run into these kinds of difficulties. Can PhD students have access to their offices, especially those in their write-up stage, and they desperately need a quiet space? This is one of our summer priorities, I think. So as undergraduates are finishing, we really need to think about the needs of our postgraduate taught and postgraduate research students and what they might need over the summer. I would say talk to your supervisor, talk to the doctoral college. The planning that I mentioned earlier is including things like this, the access needs of our postgraduate research students. And so you should start first with your supervisor in the doctoral college to get your specific information. Will exams resume in 2021 or will it be coursework? Well, there are still exams right now. We tried to change those exams into different forms of assessment where that was a good idea, where that would still allow students to show what they had learned. I think this is a kind of continual learning exercise. Exams have their place in the learning environment, definitely. So do other forms of assessment. Sometimes exams are used just because they've historically been used. Sometimes they're used because they're really necessary. I think what we want to do is make sure that we're using the right kind of assessment for the right kind of learning to allow students really to show what they've learned. So they've never really stopped. There will definitely still be, I'm sure, some exams in 2021. Whether they will be the same pattern as they have been in the past, it's very difficult to say right now. But what I can say is that the assessment that you'll be asked to do will be suitable to the module that you've taken and to the learning outcomes that you need to demonstrate. I think time for maybe one or two more. For next year, will classes be online full year or only term one? For international students, you have to pay for accommodation soon, should you book and pay. Right now, we're looking mainly in term one in terms of thinking about what term one will definitely look like. We have decided that lectures, again, that kind of lecture that I described, where you're in a room with hundreds or many other students and not very much interacting, those will be online for the whole of the academic year. At present, we haven't made any firm decisions about the second term and the second semester because we want to see where the world will be at there. And we want to make the best possible decision and not kind of pre-decide in a way that would then mean that we couldn't kind of walk back from that and do something better. So we're looking right now mainly at term one. For your accommodation, I think you need to talk to your accommodation provider. As I said, we have two halls of our own. Those are the halls where we can say something specifically about what's required. Other accommodation providers will have different terms and requirements. So fortunately, I can't say much more beyond that because there's a lot of variety out there. I think time for one more. What is the university's plan for learning if a second wave occurs and the situation gets worse rather than better? First of all, goodness me, I hope we're not in that situation. But the plan for learning would be that we would learn from the way things worked in the emergency period, and we would seek to be better, and we would seek to give more time, and we would seek to learn from what we're putting in place for the coming term as well. Without being in that situation, it's hard to say precisely. But again, your learning, your health, your well-being, utter priorities. Thank you, everybody, for all of those questions. If questions came in that I didn't get a chance to answer, we will address them and make sure that you get access to those answers. In the meantime, if it's sunny where you are, enjoy the sun. If it's not, I hope the sun will come out soon. And thank you very much for coming along. And bye.